It's really a great gift. I'm grateful for that with her.
Kirstie Alley. Her family says she has died after a short battle with cancer.
The age of 71.
Their differences weren't just visible, they were magnetic. The press couldn't get enough of it. Here was Kirstie Alley, loud and luminous and utterly uncontainable, bound to a man like Parker Stevenson, who measured his words carefully and preferred stillness over spectacle. It made for irresistible headlines and endless public fascination. After 2 years together, they made it official. On December 22, 1983, they married, and almost immediately, the world began asking the same question: how could this possibly work? But in those early years, it did work, remarkably so. Stevenson stepped into Kirstie's world, a world overflowing with laughter, late nights, spontaneous parties, and an energy that never seemed to fully exhaust itself, and found something he hadn't expected. He loved it. And Kirstie, for her part, found in Stevenson something equally unexpected. After long, relentless days on set, he was her quiet place, her stillness, the one person whose calm didn't feel like indifference but like shelter. Stevenson later described those early days with a vulnerability he rarely allowed the public to see. When we first met, I felt like I was provided with a new source of life that I had accidentally lost before. For a while, the opposites didn't just attract, they completed each other. Where she was fire, he was water. Where he withdrew, she burst forward. Their life together felt like a balancing act that somehow, against all odds, stayed upright. But beneath those early newspaper photographs, the two of them smiling, always smiling, the first fractures were already forming. Kirstie lived her emotions out loud. Stevenson kept his locked somewhere deep and private. In the beginning, that contrast felt complementary. Over time, it began to feel like a wall neither of them knew how to climb over. Still, in those golden opening years, the marriage held. It held with the kind of grip that comes from two people who genuinely believe that love, real love, is enough to bridge any gap. It was a beautiful beginning to what would become a 14-year story. A story full of joy and color and passion, but also full of shadows that were already gathering, quietly, just beyond the frame. Because what happened next, the tragedy that hit them behind closed doors while the whole world was applauding, is the part of this story that almost no one knows. And it changed everything. By the late 1980s and into the early 1990s, Kirstie Alley had ascended to the very top of her profession. Cheers had made her a household name. Her Emmy win had confirmed what her fans already knew. To the outside world, she was living the dream, celebrated, powerful, and untouchable. But inside the walls of her private life, something was breaking. The relentless pace of Hollywood stardom doesn't pause for the moments that matter most. And while Kirstie's career soared to extraordinary heights, her marriage was quietly absorbing damage that no amount of professional success could repair. Then in 1990, tragedy arrived without warning. Kirstie suffered a miscarriage, and the grief that followed was unlike anything she had ever been asked to carry. It didn't just wound her physically. It reached into the deepest part of her and left a mark that refused to fade. The woman who had always been the most vivid person in any room, the one who made everyone feel her energy the moment she walked in, grew quiet, distant, unreachable. Stevenson watched it happen and felt powerless to stop it. He later opened up about that period in People magazine, choosing his words with the careful weight of someone who had sat with that pain for a long time. Witnessing what Kirstie had to endure was a dark part of our life that we never wanted to revisit. And here is where their fundamental difference, the very thing that had once made them so beautifully complementary, became the thing that quietly tore them apart. Stevenson's instinct in the face of pain was to hold steady, to maintain order, to keep things functioning while waiting for the storm to pass. Kirstie's instinct was the opposite. She threw herself into work, project after project, role after role, not out of ambition but out of desperation, because staying busy was the only way she knew to outrun the grief that was chasing her. Two people, two completely different survival mechanisms, and no shared language to bridge the space between them. He needed silence to process. She needed noise to survive. And slowly, without either of them fully realizing it, the distance between them stopped being a gap and started being a gulf. The career success only complicated things further, because the more celebrated they became individually, the more their private struggles became public entertainment. Cameras followed. Reporters speculated. Every stumble, every quiet moment, every absence became a headline. Stevenson, ever composed, addressed the suffocating nature of that reality. When you're Private Ife becomes the subject of headlines. Finding peace in your own home becomes an immense challenge. They kept up appearances. They kept smiling. But the wounds from that devastating loss had never properly healed, and the structure of their marriage, already tested by years of opposing instincts, was now bearing far more weight than it had been built to hold. The silence between them during this period wasn't the comfortable kind. It wasn't the silence of two people at peace. It was the silence of two people who had stopped knowing what to say to each other, and had quietly, painfully, given up trying to figure it out. The cracks were no longer hairline fractures. They were visible now, and the life they had each begun to want for themselves was pointing in two very different directions. Kirstie Alley is gone, and with her departure, Hollywood lost something it may never fully recover. Yet the most haunting truth about her life has nothing to do with her legendary roles or her glittering awards. It lives inside a handwritten letter, quietly penned by Parker Stevenson on the very day she drew her last breath. As I remember it, what I said to her when we got into the car to go home was, "It's okay." For more than 20 years, the man once known as the Hardy Boys star had said nothing. He stayed silent while the world speculated, gossiped, and moved on. Then, without warning, he broke that silence, and what he revealed shook people to their core. Behind what appeared to be a wonderfully mismatched love story were buried truths about devotion, heartbreak, and wounds that never properly healed, wounds that were never allowed to see the light of public scrutiny. Don't ever feel like you have to bring me up in a war circle again. It's fine. I'm really okay with that. Hook 1. But before we get to the letter, before we get to what Parker said that no one expected, you need to understand who Kirstie Alley truly was. Because without that, none of what comes next will hit the way it should. Kirstie Alley didn't just walk into Hollywood. She arrived like a force of nature that the industry had no framework to contain. From the earliest days of her career, it was abundantly clear that she had zero interest in playing it safe. With a commanding presence, a towering height, and a personality that refused to be dimmed, she carved out an identity entirely her own in an industry that rewarded conformity and punished anyone who colored outside the lines. Everything shifted when she stepped into the role of Rebecca Howe on Cheers in 1987. That character didn't just open doors for her, it blew them off the hinges. She became an A-list powerhouse almost overnight, and her co-star Ted Danson, in an interview with the New York Times, captured what made her so impossible to ignore. He described her as someone who brought a rare, electric intensity to every scene, an energy so specific and unpredictable that no one on set could anticipate it, let alone imitate it. And the Emmy goes to Kirstie Alley. Cheers. The audience erupted, and rightfully so. In 1991, Her extraordinary blend of sharp improvisational instinct and deeply authentic performance earned her the Emmy Award for Outstanding Lead Actress, a recognition that felt less like an industry honor and more like a long-overdue acknowledgement of something everyone already knew. She then expanded far beyond the world of sitcoms. Films like Look Who's Talking turned her into an international name and made her one of the most commercially valuable actresses of her era. Producers lined up, scripts poured in. Her name alone was enough to greenlight a project. What made her endure, though, wasn't just talent. It was her relentless refusal to pretend. At a time when female stars were quietly pressured to maintain a flawless image, to smile perfectly and never show the cracks, Kirstie Alley chose a different path entirely. She spoke openly about her battles with weight. She discussed her personal faith without apology. She let the public see the real, unpolished version of herself, and somehow that made people love her more. She once reflected on the philosophy that guided her through it all. I never want to be the kind of person who fades into the crowd, because life is too short to live that way. That sentence tells you everything. It was the internal compass she relied on when critics were unkind, when the industry tried to shrink her, and when personal storms threatened to pull her under. She never faded. She only burned brighter. The years between 1987 and 1993 weren't just professionally triumphant. They were the foundation of a cultural legacy. Emmy wins, Golden Globe recognition, a place in the DNA of American pop culture that no amount of time could erase. But as with any life lived this fully, there were sorrows running beneath the surface, private losses, quiet grief, battles fought behind closed doors that the cameras never captured. She faced all of it with the dignity of someone who had decided, long ago, that she would not be broken by what life threw at her. Then came a moment, right at the very peak of everything she had built, that would redirect the entire course of her personal world. It was 1983, a crowded bar in Los Angeles, and across the room stood a man who would turn out to be everything she was not. Parker Stevenson carried himself with a composed, almost effortless elegance, the kind of quiet confidence that came naturally to someone who had played Frank Hardy on television and made it look easy. The moment Kirstie Alley saw him, something inside her shifted. This wasn't the idle admiration of one colleague noticing another. This was something far more immediate and far more certain. She turned to her roommate and said with complete seriousness, "I would die for him." It sounded dramatic because it was, but anyone who knew Kirstie Alley knew that dramatic was simply how she experienced real feelings. She didn't do subtle. She didn't do cautious. And so, despite the fact that Stevenson had arrived that evening with someone else, she didn't hesitate for a single moment. She walked over, broke every unspoken social rule in that room, and introduced herself. Rather than feeling intruded upon, Stevenson found himself completely disarmed. Years later, he spoke about that night with a candor that was rare even for him. "I was completely swept away by her. Kirstie had an intense life energy that I had never seen in anyone before." And so began one of Hollywood's most genuinely fascinating and deeply complicated love stories. Two people with almost nothing in common on the surface, one craving stillness, the other incapable of sitting still, pulled together by a gravitational force neither of them fully understood. They were, by every measurable standard, opposites, and yet somehow they fit. By the time the final chapters of their marriage were being written, the two adopted children they had raised together, William and Lily, had become the only real anchor keeping the family structure from drifting apart entirely. Kirstie needed to be seen, celebrated, constantly affirmed. Parker needed quiet, consistency, a home that felt like a refuge rather than a stage. And no matter how much they had once loved each other, those two visions of life had stopped being complementary and started being contradictory. They were no longer two puzzle pieces fitting together. They were two people walking parallel roads, moving in the same general direction, but never quite meeting in the middle. The ending, when it finally came, was perhaps inevitable. The decision to part ways. After 14 years of marriage, Kirstie Alley and Parker Stevenson filed for divorce in 1997. The Los Angeles court documents listed the reasons simply as irreconcilable differences, a clinical language that said almost nothing about the years of silent struggle, accumulated grief, and emotional distance those two words were meant to summarize. What followed was a lengthy, complicated process: asset division, custody arrangements for William and Lily, legal negotiations that stretched across months and forced both of them to set aside whatever personal wounds they were still carrying and focus on the practical realities of dismantling a shared life. The custody and financial agreements surrounding the children drew enormous media attention, placing both of them under a microscope at the very moment they were most vulnerable. When it was over, Stevenson spoke about it with the directness that had always defined him. "We were two complete opposites. That difference once made us love each other, but in the end, it was what made marriage impossible." It was an honest assessment, and it stung precisely because it was true. The same force that had drawn them together across a crowded Los Angeles bar all those years ago had, over time, become the force that pushed them apart. Kirstie, never one to shy away from hard truths, acknowledged it just as plainly. In an interview on Nightline, she reflected, "I always tried my best, but there were goals in life that we simply could not harmonize." She was careful to frame the separation not as a failure, but as a necessary act of honesty. Staying together, she suggested, would have meant continuing to live inside something that had quietly suffocated them both. For Stevenson, the end of the marriage meant leaving the Encino mansion they had shared, a home filled with the kind of organized chaos that was purely, unmistakably Kirstie. Dozens of beloved pets, rooms that hummed with her personality, a life built around her rhythms. Walking away from all of that wasn't just a change of address. It was the definitive closing of a door. Both issued a joint statement pledging to remain friends and to co-parent with unity and grace. It was the right thing to say, but as Stevenson would later admit, the reality was considerably more complicated. "Kirstie and I were not friends after the divorce. We only exchanged contact frequently for the sake of the kids." It was a blunt but honest portrait of what divorce actually looks like once the press releases are forgotten. Two people doing their best to protect their children from the fallout of a relationship that had run its course. The divorce left marks on both of them. For Stevenson, it was a reckoning, a hard-won understanding of what he needed from a partnership and what he was no longer willing to compromise. For Kirstie, it was liberation of a complicated kind, the freedom to pursue her own version of life, entirely on her own terms without negotiation. 14 years, 2 children, a lifetime of memories, some luminous, some painful, and now a quiet mutual respect measured not in romantic gestures but in the far more durable currency of shared responsibility. The legacy of a late farewell. In the years that followed, both Parker Stevenson and Kirstie Alley rebuilt their lives separately and on entirely different terms. Stevenson retreated toward the calm, grounded existence he had always craved. Kirstie, predictably, kept moving, kept performing, kept asserting herself, kept burning with that same inexhaustible energy that had defined her from the very beginning. But the thread between them never fully snapped. William and Lily, now grown, served as quiet bridges between two worlds that had officially separated but never truly lost sight of each other. And when grandchildren eventually arrived, both Kirstie and Parker found themselves occupying new roles in an extended family that time and shared history had made permanent. Then on December 5, 2022, the news broke. Kirstie Alley had passed away at the age of 71 after a brief and fierce battle with cancer. The entertainment world went silent with shock. Tributes poured in from every corner of the inn. Dustry and Parker Stevenson, the man who had loved her first and walked beside her longest, did something quietly remarkable. He broke his silence. In a short, dignified post on his personal page, he wrote the words that said everything without saying too much. "Kirstie, thank you for everything we built together, and for the children we loved." No performance, no bitterness, no reopening of old wounds, just gratitude, clean, sincere, and completely without condition. It was perhaps the most honest thing either of them had ever said about what they had shared, and it moved people deeply. Colleagues who had worked alongside Kirstie on Cheers and beyond offered their own farewells. A close friend, speaking to Variety, captured her essence with striking simplicity. Kirstie always lived to the fullest with every moment. She never let sadness control her life. That was her true legacy. Not just the Emmy, not just the films or the cultural impact or the decades of fearless reinvention. It was the way she lived loudly, lovingly, and with a refusal to be anything other than entirely herself. Today, Parker Stevenson is 74 years old. He carries himself with the same quiet dignity that has always been his signature. His legacy is no longer defined solely by the roles he played in his youth. It is equally shaped by how he chose to face one of Hollywood's most turbulent love stories, with understanding, with patience, and ultimately with grace. He has said that everything he experienced, every joy, every fracture, every painful lesson was necessary, that it all contributed to making him the person he is now. The presence of his children, his grandchildren, and his continued creative work are all evidence of a life that found its footing after years of navigating uncertain ground. The story of Kirstie Alley and Parker Stevenson is not simply a Hollywood love story with a sad ending. It is something more nuanced and more human than that. It is a portrait of two real people, genuinely different, genuinely trying, who loved each other imperfectly across 14 complicated years, raised children together, endured tragedy together, and ultimately found their way to something that outlasted the marriage itself: mutual respect. Kirstie's voice may be silent now, but what she built, the laughter, the chaos, the brilliance, the children, the grandchildren, the indelible mark she left on everyone who ever shared a room with her, none of that is gone. It simply lives on in a different form. And the handwritten letter Parker Stevenson sent on the day she died, that was his final answer to a question the world had been asking for over 2 decades. It turns out that love, even broken, even transformed, even separated by 14 years of distance and difference, has a way of finding its most honest expression at the very end. If this story gave you something to think about love, about growth, about the complicated beauty of two people choosing to see each other with kindness after everything, hit like and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe so you never miss our next documentary on the icons who shaped Hollywood and left the world a richer place for it. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching.